Originally, the script was meant to just look at critical hits in shooter games and why TF2's system is infinitely flawed, but I figured, might as well do it all. So welcome to this video, where I discuss the different ways that critical hits are used in games, as well as why certain types are better suited for certain genres. So before we begin, be sure to subscribe to watch videos of me analyzing topics that no one has ever done before, and let's get into it. Before we can get started defining the types of critical hits in games, let's first define what a critical hit is. For the purposes of this video, a critical hit is any hit that deals more damage than normal. Not every hit that does more damage is a critical hit though, as there does exist games where you can boost damage without needing a critical hit. So then, what is the difference? Usually, the critical hit has something visual or auditory that differentiates it from normal attacks. Most games tend to have a critical hit message when you land one, or a certain sound effect, or even both. Usually, critical hits are a part of a game's mechanics, and aren't something that is unintentional. Broadly speaking, when you land a critical hit, you'll know. If you don't, then you either found a glitch or you're cheating. Often, a critical hit is meant to represent the idea of landing a blow or strike that is either at a weak point or some critical area on an opponent. This is why these hits do more damage, as any weak spot is usually an area that hurts more when struck. Think of something like the back of your neck or your nose. It's meant to evoke the idea of hitting an exact area where your target is the weakest, and therefore is prone to taking more damage. Now this is very different from something like elemental or type-based weaknesses. While both cause attacks to deal more damage, critical hits are usually something that is not reliable or does not apply to every attack, whereas type-based weaknesses apply to every attack of a certain type and vary from enemy to enemy. You'll find type-based weaknesses most often in RPGs, as often they are key parts in a player's own strategy. You can still find type-based weaknesses in shooter games, however they are less common than the critical hit mechanics I will talk about in a moment. So to reiterate, critical hits are meant to be rare, and can apply to any sort of attack, but not always. Type-based weaknesses always apply, only applies to a certain category of attacks, and are usually attached to specific enemies or enemy types. Both allow attacks to deal more damage, however. Alright, now that we've defined what a critical hit is and is not, let's get into some different types of critical hits, starting with this is one of the more well-known types of critical hits and encompasses a large number of RPG games, and TF2. Essentially, most games with this mechanic just have a random number generator in the background, and if you get the correct number, you land a critical hit. Usually this does more damage, ranging from anything like 50% more damage to 3 times the damage. Some games, however, add additional mechanics to these crits, like Pokemon, where the crits bypass stat changes or can guarantee a hit for otherwise inaccurate moves, though I've never seen that be used. I have a feeling this might be incorrect, but let me know down in the comments. Games can also change how often you get these critical hits. See Pokemon again as an example, where some moves have a higher critical hit chance, and you can boost your critical hit chance with other moves. Generally speaking though, critical hits in these types of games are more of a rarity and not something that can have a whole strategy based around it. I'd like to also bring up Fire Emblem, as while critical hits are often random and rare events in these games, raising a unit's stats can make it more likely that the unit can do a critical hit. Also, there does exist a stat in those games that lowers the unit's chance of taking a critical hit themselves, and critical hits often one-shot enemies when they do happen. Overall though, for games with random critical hits, it isn't something that is common. However, it is still something that many players should consider if on the receiving end of one, and celebrate when landing one. Skill-based critical hits are something that a lot of shooter titles have. Usually they go by a different name, like headshots, but I'm lumping headshots in with critical hits as they both evoke the same idea of hitting a weak spot, and are often rare for the average player. You can see this type of critical hit in games like Call of Duty, Plants vs Zombies Garden Warfare, and Rainbow Six Siege, among others. These are meant to reward player skill and knowledge, as the head, for most games, is harder to hit than the entire body. Plus, it makes more sense realistically, as getting hit in the head is often more damaging than getting hit anywhere else. Besides your reproductive organs, of course. Survival shooters also often have headshot mechanics. Most zombie games have a headshot mechanic, and the headshot is often enough to one-shot a zombie. Again, these are meant to reward player skill, making it easier to thin out the horde with good accuracy. Shooters in general seem to be more conducive to this type of critical hit, as a lot of the skill in shooters is precise aim. What better way to reward precise aim than to give a player a target to aim for, and reward them with more damage? Random critical hits, on the other hand, don't seem to work in shooters in the same way, as seen in TF2. There have been many videos talking about why random critical hits are unhealthy for the game, and there is not as much, if any, outcry for skill-based critical hits or headshots in similar shooter games in comparison. This does make sense, as shooter games are arguably the games that allow for more skill expression than any other. Headshots only further compound this notion, allowing for easy picks if one is skilled enough to do so. Certain games like Dead by Daylight or Paper Mario have what I call minigame-based critical hits. Games like these ones I mentioned and others have some kind of minigame baked into their combat or gameplay, which is often timing based. These sorts of games often also add in a great or skillful zone where if you get perfect timing on the minigame, you gain some sort of reward, such as more damage or faster progression. These are not as common as most first-person shooters are too fast-paced to allow for such minigames, and most RPGs copy off of Pokemon or Final Fantasy, so their attack systems don't involve timing minigames. While they may not be conventional critical hits, I like to add these ones in anyway, because they evoke a similar concept to the skill-based ones, where the more skill you have in a game, the more you are rewarded. This one is a bit more contentious on whether or not it even appears on this list, but as mentioned before, some games allow critical hits to be buffed or become buffs. TF2 is once again a notable example, as there are numerous ways to gain the buff of guaranteed critical hits. Criticola, the Fan of War, and the Kritzkrieg's Uber effect are just some weapons that give buffs that guarantee some form of critical hit. And I say some form, because most of these grant mini crits instead of full crits, which only multiply damage by 130% rather than 3 times the damage. So with a few types of critical hits listed, let's talk about the good and the bad of critical hits, and when using them in your game is a good idea. If done correctly, critical hits could reward players from being good at the game or simply feel like a powerful advantage. If game mechanics even encourage a build centered around critical hits, it can allow players to feel strategically inclined or creative. Critical hits can also assist in balancing, as in Pokemon, often the best way to combat someone buffing their stats to a crazy amount is landing a critical hit. As mentioned before, when landing a critical hit, it ignores all stat changes. Being on the giving end of critical hits is almost always fun, as they make you feel powerful, and games where power fantasies are often the goal. However, being on the receiving end can feel a lot worse in comparison. Most shooter games often decide to go with the skill-based critical hit system, with Team Fortress 2 being a notable exception, which led to a lot of controversy within the community, with many community servers straight up removing the random crit system altogether. Why is this? Well, this is a problem that many shooter games suffer from, unfortunately. It can be really discouraging to get hit by a critical hit, and can feel very out of the blue or unavoidable. In games like Call of Duty or Insurgency Sandstorm, most weapons will kill in a single headshot, and if a player is really good at landing those headshots, it can become discouraging to the other team as there is really no counterplay. And in the case of TF2, getting randomly one shot out of nowhere just because your opponent got lucky is really aggravating, as there is really nothing you could do to counter it, except for the battalion's backup, but that's only on the soldier. Obviously, this isn't to say that people shouldn't go for headshots in Call of Duty or other games, as it's a huge part of the skill expression in those games. But if headshots are not handled well, then it can also lead to a lot of frustrating moments for the other side. So what can other game developers do in order to combat this frustration, while also keeping the fun elements of it? First off, I would say do not follow in Team Fortress 2's footsteps. Never make critical hits based on randomness if you are making a multiplayer game. Even if you use all the techniques mentioned after this one, random critical hits are more likely to cause frustration. The only way random critical hits can work is in single player environments, like most RPGs, and most RPGs can also do without them. Then what I would do is give some sort of indication that a player hit you with a critical hit. This is where I commend Team Fortress 2, as they highlight the weapon used to kill someone in red whenever the killing blow was a critical hit. With buff-based critical hits, making it clear that the person is affected by such a buff is also crucial, as it allows players to preemptively change their game plan before facing such a threat. Again, Team Fortress 2 does a good job of this, as when someone is affected by anything that gives them crits, their weapon glows red and has lightning sparks flying off of them. Finally, when it comes to skill-based critical hits, I like it when games simply increase the damage a weapon does by a small amount, rather than it always causing one-shots. Plants vs Zombies Garden Warfare is a good example of this, as their headshot system only mildly increases the damage a weapon does. This means that smaller weapons such as fully automatic weapons or pistols don't just deal insane damage with one projectile, and it is a lot fairer for everyone involved. And even with more powerful weapons like snipers or shotguns, there is still a lot of skill involved when making use of these headshots. Critical hits can be critical parts of gameplay, but they're not always needed. Many genres don't use critical hits, and the genres I listed in the video, namely shooters and RPGs, can do just fine without them. However, they can add a great feeling of power and satisfaction if done correctly, and can be loads of fun. That is just my opinion, however, so let me know down in the comments what you think about critical hits. Be sure to subscribe, as I upload videos like this on a regular basis. And with that, I will see you all in the next one.